Yemen, a nation often dismissed as peripheral in global affairs, has just launched a staggering 1,000 Chinese-made missiles against Israel. The reports emerging from this unprecedented attack declare Israel destroyed without remains, whether one supports or condemns, whether one celebrates or mourns. The reality before us is that the geopolitical order we have known for decades is cracking wide open. And that is where I want to take your attention today. How did we arrive at this point? What does it mean when a country like Yemen, long marginalized, long suffering under wars and sanctions, suddenly asserts such overwhelming force? This is not simply about missiles. This is about the exposure of fragility in what many assumed was an unshakable regional power. For decades, Israel has stood with a sense of impunity, backed by billions in U.S. aid and unquestioned Western support. But tonight, those assumptions have been obliterated, not by Washington, not by Moscow, not by NATO or the UN, but by Yemen, armed with Chinese technology. Doesn't that strike you? Doesn't that force us to question the very architecture of global dominance? Yemen's launch of 1,000 Chinese-made missiles against Israel has created one of the most extraordinary strategic shocks in recent political memory. For decades, Yemen was framed by the global media as a country on the margins, embroiled in poverty, war, and humanitarian crisis. Yet, from the very periphery, Yemen has delivered a blow that reverberates at the center of global politics. The sheer scale of this strike forces us to reconsider assumptions about capability, strength, and the nature of modern warfare. This is not just another regional conflict. This is a story about how those dismissed as powerless can rewrite the rules of the game in a single night. It is a reminder that history often shifts, not in the hands of the mighty, but in the unexpected moves of the underestimated. At first glance, the number alone captures the imagination: 1,000 missiles. Such a figure is not symbolic, but overwhelming. It demonstrates an unprecedented capacity not only to produce or acquire weaponry, but also to coordinate and execute a strike of such magnitude. For a nation that has endured years of airstrikes, blockades, and international isolation, to amass and unleash this scale of firepower represents more than military planning. It is a calculated statement of defiance. The sheer logistics behind such a strike beg critical questions. How could Yemen, long written off as broken and incapable, prepare and deploy this? Who underestimated them and why? These are not just military questions, but political wake-up calls. The symbolism cannot be ignored. Israel, often regarded as the fortress of Western-backed dominance in the Middle East, is portrayed as having been destroyed without remains. Whether that phrase is literal or rhetorical, the political effect is the same. It shatters the image of invincibility that Israel has cultivated for decades. What makes this moment extraordinary is not only that Israel was struck, but that it was struck from a place it least expected. The David and Goliath narrative embedded in this event is a powerful hook for global audiences, a reversal of expectations that demands attention. The supposedly weak Yemen has stood up, and in doing so has altered perceptions of what is possible. To fully understand this shock, one must place it within the broader arc of geopolitics. For years, Israel invested heavily in advanced defense systems, including the much-touted Iron Dome. Billions in U.S. aid ensured that these defenses were constantly upgraded and promoted as the most sophisticated in the world. Yet, if reports of this strike are accurate, the very cornerstone of Israeli deterrence has been pierced. Imagine the impact this has. not only on Israel's citizens and military planners, but on the allies who rely on Israel as a cornerstone of their regional strategy. If 1,000 missiles can bypass, overwhelm, or dismantle what was believed to be an impenetrable shield, then what faith can remain in the assurances of security provided by Western military superiority? This shock also invites us to consider the global audience watching closely. Countries across the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia have long been told that they must rely on alliances with great powers for survival, that their own strength is insufficient. Yemen's action turns that narrative upside down. The image of a war-torn nation delivering such a strike will echo far beyond the battlefield. It raises questions among leaders and movements worldwide. If Yemen can, why can't we? If Israel can fall vulnerable, who else might be less secure than they seem? That question is the hook that keeps this story alive, that ensures it cannot be dismissed as a one-time anomaly. Equally important is the psychological effect of scale. When smaller nations resist, their actions are often symbolic, small strikes, minor disruptions. But when the number climbs to 1,000, symbolism merges with substance. This is not a gesture, but a declaration. It conveys preparedness, depth of arsenal, and the political will to escalate beyond token gestures. The number itself becomes a weapon, not just in physical terms, but in the imagination of those who now realize that Yemen commands a stockpile capable of sustaining pressure for far longer than expected. The strategic shock lies not only in what has been done, but in the realization of what may yet come. The world has entered an era where assumptions about power are collapsing. The Yemen strike shows that warfare is no longer exclusively defined by the wealthiest nations with the largest budgets. It is now shaped by determination, ingenuity, and new alliances that defy traditional boundaries. This shock is not a fleeting moment. It is a milestone that forces every government, every military, and every citizen watching to confront a new question. What happens when the overlooked refuse to stay in the shadows and instead step forward with firepower capable of reshaping the global stage? The revelation that Yemen's massive missile strike against Israel relied on Chinese-made weaponry is a development too significant to be brushed aside as a mere detail of hardware. It marks a fundamental turning point in the global balance of power, signaling that China has quietly, steadily, and decisively extended its reach far beyond economics and trade into the realm of military influence. For decades, the global narrative has painted China as the workshop of the world, an economic engine supplying goods but avoiding direct entanglement in military conflicts. Yet now, with the smoke of 1,000 missiles rising, we see Beijing's hand more clearly than ever before. This is not just a matter of military commerce. It is a deliberate statement that China is willing to shape outcomes on the world stage, not only with money and markets, but with weapons and war. The role of Chinese weaponry here introduces a profound hook into the conversation about global order. Until now, the United States dominated the narrative of who arms whom, using weapons exports not merely as a business, but as a tool of foreign policy leverage. From F-16s in the Middle East to Patriot missiles in Europe, Washington tied its clients to a system of dependence. China, by enabling Yemen to carry out such an unprecedented strike, signals that it too can cultivate clients, not through dependency but through empowerment. The weapons in Yemen's hands were not merely functional, they were transformative. They took a nation dismissed as marginal and elevated it into the headlines of global politics. That is how China now projects influence by equipping those who were once powerless to disrupt the world's strongest. Think about the symbolic weight of this. The world has grown accustomed to associating Chinese power with trade surpluses, investments in African infrastructure, or dominance in technology supply chains. But missiles are different. Missiles announce a willingness to intervene in the most sensitive sphere of international politics, military balance. The use of Chinese-made weapons in this attack raises questions not only about Beijing's role in this particular conflict, but about the broader message it is sending to every nation that has long relied on Western arms. What if China becomes a serious alternative supplier of advanced military technology, no strings attached, no demands for political conformity, no lectures about democracy or governance? The implications would be staggering, for they would mean the erosion of one of Washington's most reliable tools of global influence. The hooks in this development go deeper when we consider perception. For leaders in nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the sight of Chinese weapons succeeding where Western ones have faltered is nothing short of electrifying. It suggests that the balance of reliability has shifted. The very phrase, "made in China," once synonymous with cheap consumer goods, is now attached to a missile strike that shook the Middle East. What does it do to the global imagination when "made in China" is no longer about toys, textiles, or electronics, but about the destruction of one of the most heavily armed states on Earth? That is more than a change in semantics. It is a revolution in perception, and perception drives politics as much as material reality. We also cannot ignore the economic dimension embedded within this development. Weapons are not just military assets, they are commodities in a market that generates immense profits and establishes long-term dependencies. By enabling a strike of this magnitude, China has demonstrated that it is not merely entering the arms market, but redefining it. Unlike the West, where arms deals are wrapped in diplomatic negotiations and endless restrictions, China positions itself as a supplier that empowers the buyer without demanding ideological alignment. This strategy not only attracts governments under Western pressure, but also creates a form of loyalty rooted in gratitude and necessity. Yemen's strike was not just a geopolitical shock, but also a commercial advertisement for China's growing military-industrial complex. What makes this development especially unsettling for the West is the precedent it sets. If China's weapons can empower Yemen to bring Israel to its knees, what might they enable elsewhere? Could African nations long subject to exploitation suddenly find themselves able to resist militarily? Could Latin American governments under constant pressure from Washington find new leverage in Chinese arms? The ripple effects of this moment extend far beyond the Middle East. They introduce uncertainty into every region where Western dominance once seemed secure. The West now faces a competitor not only in markets and technology, but in the very domain it thought it controlled, unchallenged military supply and influence. The entry of Chinese arms into such a decisive conflict illustrates a world where lines of alliance are redrawn, where smaller nations have new options, and where the monopoly of Western weaponry is shattered. This moment is not just about Yemen or Israel, but about the emergence of China as a global military actor, one willing to step into the most dangerous arenas and shift the balance of power with a single shipment of missiles. It forces us all to confront the possibility that the 21st century will not be defined by Western dominance gradually eroded, but by China's rise accelerating in ways many had failed to imagine. For decades, Israel stood as the symbol of Western-backed superiority in the Middle East, fortified by some of the most advanced military technologies, billions in U.S. aid, and the unshakable assumption that it could withstand any challenge. Its position was presented not only as militarily secure, but as morally justified, reinforced by Western leaders who portrayed Israel as a beacon of strength in a turbulent region. Yet, the events of this strike reveal just how fragile such superiority truly is. The image of a nation destroyed without remains does more than convey physical devastation. It dismantles the myth of invulnerability that has been carefully cultivated for generations. When a heavily armed, heavily defended state becomes vulnerable to a strike from a nation once dismissed as impoverished and broken, the entire architecture of Western dominance begins to look far less certain. The collapse of this assumed superiority is not only military but psychological. For years, Israel has relied on the idea that its enemies could not successfully challenge it on a grand scale. This belief was reinforced by the Iron Dome, by U.S. defense guarantees, and by the constant messaging that Israel's security was non-negotiable. But what happens when that sense of security is pierced, not by a rival superpower, but by Yemen, a country viewed as one of the weakest in the region? The hook here is undeniable. If Israel can be exposed so dramatically, what other pillars of Western power are just as vulnerable, but simply waiting for their moment of reckoning? The strike transforms not only Israel's reality, but the perception of all nations that have tethered their futures to Western might. Consider the billions upon billions spent to sustain Israel's edge. Washington poured money into missile defense systems, surveillance technologies, and advanced aircraft with the promise that these investments created an impenetrable fortress. But the outcome tells a different story. If 1,000 missiles could overwhelm these defenses, then the fortress was never as strong as it appeared. This realization undercuts one of the most persuasive arguments the West has used to maintain influence: that its weapons and alliances guarantee safety. Safety has been sold as a product, and Israel was the prime example of the product's effectiveness. The collapse of that narrative does not just affect Israel, it undermines the credibility of the entire system. This moment also reveals the deep asymmetry in global conflict. The assumption of superiority has always rested on the idea that technological dominance and wealth translate directly into battlefield victories. Yet, history repeatedly reminds us that determination, strategy, and unpredictability often outweigh sheer resources. The U.S. discovered this in Vietnam and Afghanistan. The Soviet Union discovered it in its own collapse. And now Israel, backed by the world's strongest military power, discovers that even with every advantage at its disposal, the unexpected can tear through its defenses. The story here is one of arrogance humbled by reality. The supposed giants are shown to bleed, and the world takes notice. The political implications ripple outward with enormous force. Arab nations, long skeptical of Israel's dominance, now see the cracks exposed. Movements across the global South witness a symbolic victory, proof that even the strongest can falter. For Western capitals, this is a nightmare scenario because their model of power depends on projecting inevitability. They must appear untouchable to maintain influence. The Yemen strike strips away that illusion, showing that inevitability is nothing more than a carefully constructed myth. Once shattered, myths cannot be rebuilt so easily. And in that loss of confidence lies the real danger for the West. There is also an economic undertone that cannot be ignored. Western superiority has not just been military but financial, with the United States positioning itself as the indispensable partner in security arrangements. Nations were expected to buy into this system, purchasing arms, signing defense agreements, and aligning politically in exchange for protection. But if protection fails, what then? Why would countries continue to invest billions in weapons systems that prove unable to defend their supposed strongest ally? The economic model of Western arms superiority is destabilized when its showcase client is exposed as vulnerable. This is a hook that resonates not just in military circles, but in boardrooms and parliaments across the globe. What makes this collapse even more striking is its timing. The West already faces challenges from shifting global alliances, economic strains, and the visible rise of China and Russia as alternatives. Against that backdrop, the image of Israel humbled magnifies the sense of decline. It becomes a case study for those who argue that Western hegemony is not merely fading, it is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The irony is almost poetic. A small, beleaguered nation delivers the kind of strike that decades of opposition could not achieve, and in doing so, it accelerates a global transition that the West has fought so hard to delay. The world will not soon forget this moment. The collapse of assumed superiority is not a footnote in history, but a turning point. Israel's vulnerability is not only its own, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of Western dominance. And once the world sees the cracks in the armor, it cannot unsee them. The question now is not whether the illusion can be repaired, but how many more such shocks await before the old order finally gives way to the new? The strike that saw Yemen unleash 1,000 Chinese-made missiles against Israel is not just a single event, it is a signal flare in the night sky, illuminating a global order that is no longer fixed, but in the midst of profound transition. For much of the last century, power seemed to rest comfortably in the hands of a few dominant nations, with the United States and its allies assuming the role of arbiters of war and peace. Smaller nations were expected to fall in line, to operate within boundaries defined for them by empires and alliances. Yet, what we witness now is the unraveling of that script. A nation once considered peripheral and broken has struck at the heart of one of the most protected states in the world. This is not just a clash of arms, it is the unfolding of a world where multipolarity is no longer a theory, but a lived reality. One of the hooks that makes this moment so gripping is its unpredictability. Multipolarity has long been discussed in abstract terms. Academics, diplomats, and analysts predicting the gradual rise of China, the steady resurgence of Russia, or the emergence of regional powers like India, Turkey, and Brazil. But rarely did anyone imagine Yemen, one of the poorest nations on earth, as the one to demonstrate the new rules of the game so vividly. By launching this strike, Yemen inserted itself into a global narrative that is no longer neatly organized into great powers and small states, but into a complex and unpredictable mix where even the marginalized can dictate headlines. That unpredictability is what makes this event so transformative, because it forces every nation to confront the possibility that old hierarchies no longer guarantee safety. At the heart of this transition is the erosion of Western monopoly over force and influence. For decades, Western capitals dictated who could be armed, who could resist, and who had to submit. The control was not only military but political, shaping the very structure of international institutions, trade agreements, and global norms. What this moment shows is that control has slipped. If China can empower Yemen, if smaller nations can strike with devastating force, then the carefully managed order the West depended upon has already fractured. This fracture is not an isolated crack, but the beginning of a collapse that can no longer be denied. The economic dimension of this transition is equally significant. Western dominance rested on a triangle of finance, trade, and military supremacy. Each supported the other. Financial strength funded military might protected trade routes, and trade cemented financial supremacy. But the Yemen strike demonstrates that these pillars are no longer as stable as they once were. China, by supplying arms and building global economic ties simultaneously, offers an alternative structure. Nations wary of dependency on the West now see an opening. Why submit to the old triangle when a new one is emerging, offering weapons, markets, and infrastructure without the same political strings attached? The strike acts almost like a billboard announcing that the old guarantees are no longer reliable and that alternatives exist. The psychological impact of this transition should not be underestimated. Western superiority thrived on the assumption that its dominance was unquestionable, that resistance was futile. But the imagery of Israel, once considered unassailable, humbled by a nation like Yemen, undermines that psychological edge. It provides a model for resistance not only in the Middle East, but globally. It suggests that in a multipolar world, the weak have tools and strategies that can level the playing field in ways once unimaginable. This sense of empowerment spreads faster than missiles themselves, reshaping the calculations of leaders, resistance movements, and even ordinary citizens who see that empires are not immortal. The hooks here are layered: a shift from unipolar to multipolar, from certainty to unpredictability, from Western dominance to contested influence. What makes it especially compelling is that this transition is not orchestrated by the obvious powers alone, but accelerated by the actions of those long dismissed as irrelevant. That reversal of roles, the supposedly powerless rewriting the script, grabs global attention because it resonates with a deeper truth about history. The unexpected often drives change more than the predictable. The transition we now see is not a slow drift, but a rapid reordering, where nations no longer measure themselves only against the West, but against each other, choosing alliances, technologies, and strategies that best serve their interests. In this fluid environment, power is diffuse, influence is contested, and no single state can claim to dictate outcomes. Yemen's strike makes that plain because it demonstrates in the most dramatic way that even the smallest actors now possess the means to shape the direction of history. That is the essence of the new order: not stability, not predictability, but the constant possibility of surprise. So, as we close, I want to leave you with this. Do not be lulled into thinking this is only about Yemen, only about Israel, only about missiles. This is about the turning of a tide that will reshape the world we live in. A tide that may empower the global South, challenge monopoly of Western arms, and expose the hollowness of empires built on inequality. And whether you see this as tragedy or triumph, one truth remains: history has a way of humbling those who believe they are invincible. Tonight, Israel has been humbled. Tomorrow, who knows? The only certainty is that the world we knew yesterday is gone, and a new one is already being written before our very eyes.